Clarke joins us now from Nottingham. Halfway through the campaign, Ken Clarke, I was sitting in the second row of the news conference when you told us if there's a hung parliament, the IMF will be in. Will they be?
If it's a hung parliament and you can't manage your debt, the IMF will be in, certainly. And so now we've got a hung parliament. We've got the second condition is very important. We need a stable government. We need a strong government. The policies come first, as Simon said, and we've got to demonstrate we're in control of this debt. Otherwise, sometime in the next year or two, certainly we'll have a bond market crisis. Certainly the IMF will come in. That's why, in the national interest, the parties that obviously have got to look to form the next government, the Conservatives and the Liberals, have got to get together and work out a programme, not just for the next week or two, but for the next 2 or 3 years, which is, I think, the minimum amount of time it will take to steer this country out of danger and get us back to normal levels of growth.
But you've run the Treasury before, and you know that that's a one-man band job. The idea that you are going to start talking to Vince Cable and God knows who, trying to sort out when you'll do the deficit cutting, the Liberals want it later than you do, I mean, it's unthinkable.
No, I think it's perfectly possible to have those conversations. I think everybody knows that whoever won this election, we were going to have spending cuts. We were going to have to tackle the deficit. And the differences between us are not such that sensible politicians, responsible politicians, should begin by saying, oh, we can't possibly agree upon that. There are 2 cabinet ministers in the Treasury. I'm not sure whether anybody's going to look at that or not. That's not a matter for me. But the actual policies, I'm sure, of getting on top of the debt and the deficit could be discussed. Vince, after all, Vince and I agreed about the problem. I didn't agree with Vince on all the cures, but I'm sure somebody could sit down with Vince and get very near to something in the national interest.
Yes, you agree on the broad brush of having to cut the deficit, but the trouble is there's a fundamental difference between you on the timing. Nick Clegg said that to cut the deficit now would be economic masochism. Doesn't sound like he's ready to start right away. You want to go now.
Well, with great respect, the argument about the $6 billion of efficiency savings in the first year, whilst I do stick strongly to my own personal opinion, it was a small part of the bigger problem. What really needs to be tackled is the full public spending round, the plan for the next 3 or 4 years. That has to be addressed. And if we have a hung parliament, which I personally hoped we would avoid, with a hung parliament, it is our duty to get together and try to work out how we can get a programme for governing over the next 2 or 3 years.
But you'd abandon that absolute prerequisite to start paying it down right now in the interests of getting a coalition to stand up to the markets?
No, I would discuss why we have to stop cutting out waste in the first year. I mean, don't start getting us down to details. My opinion is my opinion. But I think that there are much bigger issues in the economy when you look at the Parliament as a whole, and that is actually one of the comparatively small ones. And David Cameron in his statement mentioned compromise. Well, compromise may be necessary and is necessary. The advocates of electoral reform want hung parliaments always. They want this situation after every election. Well, the Liberals, I'm afraid, have got the balance of power, and David Cameron's prepared to sit down with them and say, well, now demonstrate that when you are in a position to influence, when you might have a say in the next government, might be involved in the process of government, demonstrate we can make it work. And that is why he gave some examples of where we're really not too far from the Liberals in other policy areas.
Well, of course, you'll derive huge comfort because you're virtually the only Europhile minister likely to be in the cabinet. I mean, the real passionate believer in Europe. And you're going to be joined by Nick Clegg. Won't that be fun for you?
Well, I'm about as Europhile as the Liberals. I think there are other people who are not that Eurosceptic in the Conservative shadow cabinet. I mean, cabinet seats will undoubtedly be on the table. And I actually think David's statement that we want no more transfer of powers to Europe is one which I agree with, and I very much doubt whether any of the Liberals disagree with that. We've had enough of treaties about competence, and nobody wants to go any further down that road in the foreseeable future. And
let me just ask you...
Quite rightly, John, you're trying to open up areas where you think there might be disagreements. This is a national crisis. We have had an election. We can't fool about arguing about electoral reform. We need to form a government, and electoral reform, which is an important subject, because we're so far apart, have to go to a speakers' conference or an inter-party conference, which it usually does. The experience of trying to run a government in a hung parliament could influence the eventual outcome of the debate
Right.
about whether we want a multi-party parliament leading to coalition governments in future.
Well, let me go quickly to another direction then. Let me tap your expertise elsewhere. Do you think the markets will bear a minority government, a minority Tory government, going it alone?
I'm very frightened of the markets looking at a situation where fear began to spread that the British were not capable of getting this deficit down, getting rid of the structural deficit, making sure that the debt could be managed. I mean, and when you get into a problem, everybody rather reads too much into the day-by-day movements in the markets, which sometimes do illustrate some alarm. But what I don't want is in the next 2 or 3 years, I don't want a bond market crisis. I don't want us eventually to drift into a situation where the markets take off and we're really in the serious position of countries which have deficits very like our own. That's why now, in the national interest, the political leaders have got to persuade their followers to form a strong government,
Right.
either with Liberal support or with Liberal participation, agreed on a programme of things they're going to deliver.
Ken
And if
Clarke?
it's beyond the wit of man, can't do that, then I think that kills the case off for electoral reform. We obviously can't handle a multi-party parliament.
Ken Clarke, thank you very much indeed for talking with us. When we come back, the pound slides and markets tumble in the wake of the election uncertainty, and after a night of political shocks,